Governor asked me to go out after the State of the State speech and talk to a few people in different regions of the state. I feel very comfortable coming here. I'm an old farm boy from White County originally, over in Carmine, and went to law school at Carterville, so I don't feel unfamiliar here in Southern Illinois. I know sometimes it seems like the lost end of the state or the far away end of the state, and certainly that's not my attitude. I don't think that's Governor Quinn's attitude. I think the key point in the Governor's State of the State speech is that we've come a long way out of the crisis that we saw in 2009. It was a triple crisis. One governor in jail, another one on the way, the first impeachment in the state's history, no transition to a new governor. That was an ethics crisis of huge proportion, something we've had to work through and restore our state's reputation. We had the crisis that I'm going to talk about a little more today of pension system, where the payments hadn't been made at the proper amount in decades, leading to huge structural deficits, a problem of Medicaid continuing to grow at much higher rates of expense than our revenue system produces. And while those governors were not paying attention to the business of the state and paying attention to the wrong things, these problems were being ignored. And that left us in a much worse position in other states as we headed into the worst recession since the 1930s. All states have faced that, but that was the triple crisis that we faced. We've come through that. We've survived that. We didn't go off the cliff. And now we have this period where we've got to address those bigger problems, but we've also got to put renewed focus on the economy and how we recover the economy. Job growth has been too slow coming out of the recession throughout the country, and we've got to address that in very specific ways. So I really want to talk about three things mainly today, and then take your questions. We want to listen. We've got to formulate economic strategies. We've got to work with people that are involved in that area, whether they're banking or politics or working economic development agencies or in educational institutions that are such a key part of that strategy. But we've also at the same time got to go ahead and resolve the problems that we've got in pension reform and Medicaid cost containment. And so, the governor's speech at the State of the State emphasized really the third, the economic growth component. And if you look at this chart, this is a very general chart on the budget. It really talks about the General Revenue Fund. We start over there at the left at about $30 billion coming in back in fiscal 2008, and you'll see that the blue line is mainly below the red line. Now that's wrong. The blue line is the revenues. They're supposed to be above the expenditures. You'll see that they were below that even going into the recession, and as we went into the recession, those revenues plummeted. We went to $3 billion less in collections. As we passed the tax increase and as the economy began to recover, then the blue line approaches and begins to go over the red line, which is the expenditures. This is all expenditures in the General Revenue Fund. And then in the last year, this is a projection out to 2015, as the temporary tax increase starts to come off. We anticipate that we'll start to go back the other direction if nothing further is done. So this is the general situation we're in. This big gap there where the blue line goes way below the red line, that's where we got the big run-up in unpaid bills in our state. And we're in a period now of relative, there in the middle, of relative fiscal stability where we can begin to more clearly address the long-term problems. The Civic Committee the other day acknowledged a very important fact, and that is that discretionary spending in Illinois since fiscal 2008 is down 2.2%. That's never happened in our history, that discretionary spending, this is the spending in the governor's agencies and education, all the things that you usually hear debated in Springfield about. For that spending to be down over a 4-year period is a huge, huge change. But what it also reflects is a greater underlying problem, because you have to add into that discretionary spending, which is over 2/3 of this total. You have to add into this discretionary spending the things we don't have direct control on, the pension payments that go up. In fiscal 2008, our pension payments required by law were about $2.8 billion. We've been making those every year, even though we had to borrow them for a couple of years. This year they're at $5.35 billion. That's not a discretionary number. That's not a number that we have control over through the appropriations process. And if you combine that with the increase in Medicaid that's going up about 6% a year, even though the federal government pays half of it, that creates what we call the squeeze on the rest of the budget. The squeeze on our educational priorities, the squeeze on our human service priorities, the squeeze on our prison costs and our public safety costs. And these are very difficult budgetary problems. But there's also a problem that if we have about $34 billion now in the base revenues in the General Revenue Fund, and you grow that at 3% a year, $33 billion at 3% a year is $1 billion. So you get $1 billion worth of revenue growth at 3%. But our economy is not growing at 3%. Our economy is growing at closer to 2%. And so that compounds the squeeze. It makes it worse. It gives us a harder hill to climb. And that's why the governor said in his speech that the emphasis on economic growth throughout our state is hugely important. Here's the real problem where we're much worse than other states, and that's our unfunded pension liability. We have the state systems. The state employees are about 1/4 of the state's pension system. The university employees are about 1/4 of the state's pension system. And downstate teachers, all teachers not in Chicago, all the suburbs, all of downstate are in the teachers' retirement system. That's about half of our pension system in Illinois. And those systems have an unfunded liability that's built up over decades of underpayment. The problem was recognized in the mid-90s when a 50-year funding plan was passed, but that 50-year funding plan continued to underfund the pension on purpose and by law, and you can see how the unfunded liability has grown over that period, where we have the worst unfunded liability of any pension system in the country, and it's 13% of our state gross product. Those are not frightening numbers, but they are numbers that mean we have to pay some attention to this problem. And so we have the pension working group working today, meeting in Springfield. We had our first meeting last week. And the approach that's been successful in Illinois and will continue to be successful is one of bipartisan cooperation on these major problems. We passed the Capitol bill in 2009, just 3 months after Governor Quinn was sworn in. It had been in gridlock for 10 years. And when you have a governor that's not even talking to the legislative leaders, which is the situation we had under the prior governor, as he became more and more isolated, you don't solve problems like that. You don't solve problems by not talking to the other party or the other legislative leaders. But we solved that readily in April of 2009 and passed a $31 billion capital plan with bipartisan cooperation. Everybody signed on to that. The Republicans signed on, the Democrats signed on, and last year when we looked at what the capital program was doing, I'm having trouble with this one. I've knocked it over twice now, I'm sorry. When we looked at what the capital program was doing, 50,000 people were working throughout our state, building roads, highways, building buildings, working on the transportation center at SIU and many other university buildings, and it's a key part of what we're doing to go forward. And that approach has continued to work. We hadn't had a workman's compensation reform in Illinois in 30 years, and it's really hard to do because you've got the medical society very interested, you've got the trial lawyers very interested, you've got organized labor very interested, you've got the business groups, the State Chamber of Commerce and the Manufacturers Association very interested, but all 5 groups have different views, and all 5 groups can stop the passage of a reform in Springfield because they can pull off legislative votes and prevent your reform. But we were able to get all 5 groups to sit down, and we were able to enact, with bipartisan votes, a $500 million savings in the workman's compensation system that leaves the system intact. Injured workers are still getting paid, but provides a more competitive system in our state. We've done the same on the unemployment reform that just passed last year. We've done the same on the Medicaid reform in January that passed last year. That's really the key to going forward. So when we sat down, Jerry Sturmer and I from the governor's office, with Senator Brady from the Republican Senate caucus, Senator Rezin from the Republican Senate caucus, Representative Darlene Singer from the House Republican caucus, along with Representative Neckrich from the House Democrats and Senator Nolan from the Senate Democrats. This is really the way you take on these hard problems and work with both parties to solve them. And so we're working very hard on that. We'll meet again tomorrow and Wednesday with that same group on a regular basis to work to achieve a further pension reform to address this problem. Because there are solutions to it, and they're workable. And as Jerry Sturmer likes to say, a few people may have to take a haircut, but nobody's going to get scalped. The same thing happens on Medicaid. Now, this is what happens if we don't do anything about Medicaid. It just gets worse and worse. But we do have a Medicaid working group. It's already met before the governor's budget speech. It has a similar group of bipartisan members from the House and Senate. They've worked together last January to pass a Medicaid reform that put Illinois on the pace for the first time to use coordinated or managed care. It had set a target of over 50% of our Medicaid people going into that program, and that group is going to continue to meet. You may have seen the AP story over the weekend where Julie Hamos, the Secretary of Healthcare and Family Services, talked about the challenge of Medicaid and how everything was going to be on the table. That working group will meet again on February 16th, even before the governor's budget speech. Not waiting till the budget speech to start to address these tough issues, but meeting repeatedly even before the budget speech. And they'll continue after the budget speech when the governor will talk more about his priorities and how he wants to address these problems. But these groups are meeting, and that system works. And we're lucky that we've got a state where we've got some history of working together in a bipartisan way. They're having trouble with that out in Washington today, but we're making progress on that. When we were in the fall session and we had the challenge of a couple businesses talking about, well, maybe we'll have to leave Chicago, the CMA Group or Sears, we were able to work, and Representative John Bradley, you just walked in right on cue, John, and Representative John Bradley did the same thing in the Revenue Committee, working with Representative David Harris and working with Senator Troy Hutchison and others in the Senate to come up with a bipartisan tax proposal to address those issues. And they added to it not just specifics for two specific companies, but they added to it an R&D credit on a permanent 5-year basis. The beginning of the phase out of the corporate tax increase by changing the net operating loss so companies could again take their losses, which we suspended back in January when we passed the tax increase. Providing as well tax benefits for working families through the earned income tax credit to create consumer demand. Those working families that get the earned income tax credit, first of all, they've got to be working, they've got to have a job, qualify for it, and working families with children get that credit. We doubled that credit up to 10% of the federal credit. They're still not the largest in the country. Minnesota has 33% of the federal credit, but moved us up. We know that the people that receive those tax benefits are going to go spend them at local small businesses and throughout the state to create consumer demand. That's 70% of our economy in the country. That's hugely important. And finally, indexing the personal exemption to inflation like the federal government has done for decades, but we haven't done it in Illinois. That kind of work that the governor is doing with people like John Bradley, I want to thank John for all his work on that. He worked very hard on that. And spent, I think, a few sleepless nights, a lot of time on the phone. I think the Thanksgiving holiday, you spent working on that, not just the session. That's the path to being able to solve the problems and go forward. Here's the real story on the economy now. This chart doesn't include the farmers. And I wish we had better numbers on farm employment. But these are the Bureau of Labor Statistics data for the state of Illinois for non-farm employment. This is payroll employment. Doesn't include the self-employed either, which are also key parts of an entrepreneurial economy. But you can see this goes back to 2000. And you can see the effect of cycles in the economy, where the recession in the early part of the decade down to 2003 or so, unemployment dropped. And then as the economy recovered back to 2007, unemployment rebounded. And then we turned down as Lehman Brothers collapsed and we went into the heart of the economic crisis. You can see the very steep drop of the Great Recession. This is atypical, it's huge, it's a huge problem, and you can see we're coming back. We've added since the bottom there over 100,000 jobs in Illinois, and just last year right at 54,000 jobs in Illinois by this measure. We have a strong economy in our state. It's resilient. It bounces back. It's diversified. U.S. News and World Report, as the governor pointed out in his state speech, said that Illinois is one of the top 5 business-friendly states. They didn't have to say that. They did that based on real analysis and real numbers. Career Builder found Illinois in the top 10 states of places to find a job. They run a website, careerbuilder.com, about finding a job. They know what they're talking about. They know there are job opportunities here, and then our economy grows. And my favorite is moneyrates.com. I looked at it again this morning on the way down. They said that Illinois was the top state, #1, in best places to earn a living, against some real strong competitors like Washington State and Georgia and others. And they rated us higher because we're a high-income state, we have strong employment, and they also know that we have a low average state tax rate even after the tax increase, based on many other really high-tax states around the country, like Wisconsin and New York and California, that have much higher rates than we do. But this is important, and the work is to get this to accelerate. This has got to get back up to the peak, not just recover a little bit with 100,000 jobs. And so the governor called for additional tax incentives that are paid for. When John Bradley worked on those tax incentives in December, he wanted to make sure they were paid for, and that we had in the budget enough revenue growth as our sales tax recovered to be able to pay for those. So if you have a strategy of using targeted tax relief, and the governor has proposed that again in terms of the utility tax on natural gas, which hits both consumers and businesses. It hits farmers particularly hard. The reporter pointed out in the State Journal Register this weekend, because they dry that corn with natural gas and they have to pay a tax on that. So do the grain elevators. That is a product going straight into our export market, and when we lower the cost of doing that in a targeted way, that'll cost us $164 million a year. But when it spurs further economic growth, and we can show in the budget, as we will when the governor does his speech on February 22nd, that we can pay for that. These are important targeted incentives. They set a direction. They say to the business community, to the farmers, to business and consumers, we're going to move forward in Illinois. Likewise, the governor called for a child tax credit, because raising kids is a crucial and important thing long term. Those are our families that are under stress, and their spending with a little tax relief helps stimulate the economy. And he called for a veterans tax credit. Every one of our veterans that's been to Afghanistan and Iraq, they all volunteered. They weren't drafted. We don't have a draft anymore. They stepped forward, and to say today that their unemployment is double the national average is something we cannot tolerate, and we've got to do something about. And so we have a tax credit, and they're up to $5,000 for businesses that will hire veterans going forward. And we think that that is really, really important. This is the tax relief I just talked about, the three parts that are part of the governor's plan. But we need that to be part of a more comprehensive plan to stimulate the economy. So the governor has also proposed that we extend the capital bill. We passed $1.6 billion in the capital bill in 2009 for school construction, and much of that has been done or is underway. That will only get us through the 2003 qualified list that was established years ago in the gridlock. And we've got to go further and make our schools 21st century schools. The P20 Council, which works on, I'm an old school board member, so I always think K-12. I still do, kindergarten through 12th grade. But the P20 Council deals in preschool all the way to 20 years of education. They have pointed out and have targeted in their metrics that we need to raise the number of people in our state who have a college degree, or who have an associate's degree from the community college, or who have a trade certificate for a trade based on training. That part of our population are those that are going to participate in the international economy. Now, they're the people that are going to have the above average jobs. They're going to make us strong. And even in the recession, in the last couple of years since Pat Quinn has been governor, the percent of our population that meet those three criteria has grown from 41%, which is above the national average, by the way, to 43%. And so the governor in the State of the State speech set a target and said, and working with Lieutenant Governor Sheila Simon, who recommended this as well, set a target that we need that to get to 60% by 2025. So that 60% of our citizens have got a college degree or an associate's degree that qualifies them with a skill, or a trade certificate, through a labor union or an apprentice program, or a trade. so that they're better employable. That's what's going to enable us to compete in the world economy. The governor in that speech also named Dan Uskin, the CEO of Navistar, to an export council to further emphasize export. And he also called for a clean water initiative to repair, put people to work, further repairing our water and sewer around the state and communities all over the state. And we can do this within our current resources and our budget by putting emphasis on continuing to expand our infrastructure program. Our $31 billion infrastructure program passed in 2009 is the largest in the state's history and virtually the largest in the country. We're doing more in infrastructure than any other state. And we have to continue to do that. We can't just do it once every 10 years and stop. We've got to go ahead and go to the next step. And so the governor believes that doing water infrastructure and doing educational infrastructure, are keys to do that. The gigabit communities, I like this one because I have a hard time spelling this and I have a hard time saying that word. I'm not familiar with it. But we've got to get familiar with these new ideas. A gigabit community is a community that uses the internet. Google's been working on this. That's 100 times faster than the current internet. And so the governor announced a grant competition. You can go to this website, gigabit.illinois.gov, to get details for that application. And grants will be available for communities, whether it's educational institutions, cities, groups of entrepreneurs, businesses that want to establish a gigabit community where there are 1,000 users clustered together in one geography or in one area to use this higher speed internet. That's the way you attract innovation. That's the way you get out there and compete with the new ideas in the world. Tom Friedman has said the key to one of the keys to economic growth is to have smart cities that are job engines of the future. And so the gigabit initiative, if we can all learn to say it and learn to spell it, is part of that. And so we have a strategy in our state, and we've got to add to the strategy and move forward. The strategy is about education, that 60% target of having an educated, talented workforce. That's one of the reasons we're a high-income state today. We've got to continue to do that and keep the focus on education. We've got to keep developing our infrastructure and going forward on that. And we've got to pursue innovation, like this gigabit initiative, to go on to the next step. Our competitors are not Wisconsin and Indiana, and they really aren't. They're in China, in Poland, in Turkey, in Brazil, in Singapore, and Korea. That's the community that we are competing in, and we have to go forward in. And we're doing a good job of that already. This is that same time period as the economic period that tracks Illinois exports. You see they went up in the early part of the decade. They fell off in the recession. They grew even more heading into 2007. They went down in the recession. And look at the final number. We're way above the pre-recessionary peak in exports in Illinois. We are leading the economy, leading ourselves out of the recession with this sector being stronger than all the others. Our employment is not up to pre-recession level, but our exports are up there and beyond it. This is based on the strength of companies like Carterville and John Deere. This is based on the strength of our Illinois farmers who are sending 1/4 of our soybeans just to one country, China today, through the export market. This is in the strength of our chemical industry and our manufacturing. And we've got to continue to work this throughout our state and make sure that we're going forward. The governor is going to continue to lead trade missions. He was in China last year. The president of China visited Chicago last year. The only state besides Washington he visited on his state visit to our country. We are the leading exporter in the country that is not on the coast. The states on the coast, like Washington State with Boeing, have a huge advantage. They got the ocean right there. They're really equipped to export. Same on the East Coast and other places. But we're the inland port of the country and the 5th largest exporter in the country as a result. And we've got to continue to build on that strength going forward.